The workday started like any other. I scrolled through my phone, checking the first few orders that had come in, and mentally mapped out my route. There was always a certain rhythm to these shifts, a list of stops, street names blurring into one another, and the steady hum of the engine between deliveries. Nothing about today felt different. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting a dull gray hue over the city streets. I navigated through the familiar congestion, the radio playing softly in the background. It was just another day, one stop after the next. Each time I handed over a package or bag of food, I forgot about it the moment I turned away. That's how these shifts went. Fast, impersonal, and forgettable. My next destination was a building I hadn't been to before. An old apartment complex tucked between two newer developments. Its exterior hinted at better days long gone. The paint peeled away in long strips, the windows were clouded with grime, and weeds poked through cracks in the concrete. I barely registered it. Places like this weren't rare in this part of the city. I pulled my car up to the curb, grabbed the delivery bag from the passenger seat, and made my way to the entrance. As I walked, I went over the mental checklist I followed with every delivery. Hand it off, make sure it's the right apartment, get in, and get out. The building's entrance door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway with faded wallpaper and a scent of old carpets and dust. My footsteps echoed unnervingly down the corridor. I scanned the numbers on the doors, calculating how far I needed to go. Just as I found my bearings, I heard footsteps coming toward me from the other end of the hallway. A man emerged from the shadows of the dim corridor, his tall, broad frame almost brushing the walls. His face was set in a cold, expressionless mask. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, not hurried, not relaxed, just deliberate. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence, and yet his absence of reaction felt deliberate. For a second, an uneasy chill gripped me, a gnawing discomfort I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was nothing. In a city this size, you get used to seeing strange people. The odds of bumping into someone unsettling weren't exactly slim. I shrugged it off, adjusted the delivery bag slung over my shoulder, and continued down the hall. But something about the man's cold gaze stayed with me, even as I approached the apartment door. I found the right door, checked the address on the bag one more time, and gave it a firm knock. The sound echoed briefly, then faded into the silence of the hallway. I knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. No shuffling footsteps, no voice calling out from inside. Just the kind of silence that settles in places forgotten by time. I shifted my weight, trying to decide whether to leave the bag at the door and move on to the next delivery. Then I heard it, a faint sound from the other side of the door. At first I thought it might have been my imagination, but as I leaned closer, I recognized it. Labored breathing, shallow and unsteady. My skin prickled with unease. This wasn't normal. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The building was quiet around me, too quiet. I gave the doorknob a quick test, expecting it to be locked. Instead, it turned easily in my hand, and the door creaked open with a slow groan. The door swung inward, revealing the dim interior of the apartment. A strange tension hung in the air, heavy and thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I took a cautious step inside, the delivery bag still in my hand. "Hello," I called out, my voice low and uncertain. No response. The only sound was that ragged breathing, now louder and more distinct. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw him, the man lying on the floor, sprawled out like a puppet with its strings cut. His face was bruised and swollen, his arms marked with purplish blotches. I froze for a second, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. This was no accident. Someone had hurt him. My heart thudded in my chest as I knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. I reached for his wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. Relief mixed with the growing fear in my gut. Without thinking, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed for an ambulance. As the operator asked me questions, I gave her the details as best I could, my voice shaking but steady enough. They told me help was on the way. I stayed beside the man, not knowing what else to do. The room felt colder, and every creak from the hallway made me flinch. Something was terribly wrong here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the man I'd seen earlier in the hallway had something to do with it. But that was a thought I couldn't afford to dwell on. Not now. As I stayed by the man's side, the weight of the situation began to sink in. His chest rose and fell in uneven intervals, as though every breath was an effort. I glanced around the room. There were signs of a struggle everywhere. The coffee table had been knocked over, a chair was overturned, and a shattered lamp lay in pieces across the floor. I wanted to search the apartment for anything that might help explain what happened, but the man's condition kept me rooted. His bruises looked fresh, too fresh. Someone had done this, and it hadn't been long ago. Every moment I spent waiting felt like an eternity. There was a gnawing question at the back of my mind. Had the man in the hallway been the one responsible? The timing was too close to ignore. And yet, I had no proof, only the unsettling look on his face as he'd passed me moments before. I kept my focus on the injured man, listening to his strained breaths and watching for any change. The phone call with the dispatcher had been short, but the wait for the ambulance dragged on endlessly. The apartment was eerily quiet now, except for the man's labored breathing. I thought about calling out into the hallway, but the thought of that strange man still lurking nearby kept me silent. It was better to stay inside, where at least I could control what was happening. At least, that's what I told myself. Minutes ticked by. I checked my phone again, hoping for some update, but there was nothing. I knelt closer to the unconscious man, wondering if there was anything more I could do until help arrived. He stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. I couldn't stop thinking about that man in the hallway, how deliberately he'd moved, the coldness in his expression. Was he gone, or was he still out there, waiting for something? I stayed by the man's side, torn between my instinct to leave and my responsibility to help. Every noise from the hallway set me on edge. A door creaked, footsteps echoed in the distance. I found myself holding my breath each time, expecting someone to barge in, but no one did. I tried to convince myself that the man in the hallway had been a coincidence, that he had nothing to do with this. But the more I thought about it, the less certain I felt. There was something off about the whole situation, something I couldn't put into words. The minutes stretched, each one feeling heavier than the last. I could hear distant sirens now, faint but approaching. Relief flickered, but it was accompanied by a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. What if the man came back before the paramedics arrived? What if there was more to this than I realized? I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. All I could do was wait. The paramedics arrived faster than I expected. Two of them rushed in, moving with practiced precision, while I stepped aside to give them space. I watched as they checked the man's pulse, placed an oxygen mask over his face, and carefully lifted him onto a stretcher. "He's lucky you found him when you did," one of them said, though the words barely registered. I nodded, numb from the adrenaline still coursing through me. They asked a few questions, basic things, how I found him, how long he'd been unconscious. I gave them the answers as best I could, though my thoughts kept drifting back to the man in the hallway. As the paramedics prepared to leave, I found myself standing in the doorway, staring out into the corridor. The paramedics thanked me again before wheeling the stretcher out of the apartment. I stood there for a moment, watching them disappear down the hall. Then, without another word, I closed the door behind me and left. Moving into our first apartment felt like the start of something special. Elisa and I had spent the entire day unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and finding a place for every little thing we owned. By the time evening rolled around, exhaustion hit us hard, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that we were finally settling in. Our new apartment was modest but perfect for us. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and just enough space to feel cozy. As we admired our efforts, the excitement of this new chapter in our lives was undeniable. After hours of moving things around, the hunger hit. Cooking wasn't an option, so we turned to the familiar comfort of food delivery. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through the delivery app, and ordered from one of our favorite spots. Elisa smiled, already imagining the meal. The app estimated 40 minutes for delivery, enough time to relax for a bit. We settled into the couch, enjoying the rare stillness after such a long day. We had barely begun to unwind when the doorbell rang, cutting through the quiet. I glanced at my phone. Only 15 minutes had passed since I placed the order. That didn't make sense. Already? Elisa said, raising her eyebrows. I shrugged, more confused than concerned. Delivery times could be unpredictable, I told myself. Maybe they were faster tonight. I walked to the door, expecting to see the food bag in someone's hand. But as I cracked the door open slightly, I was met with something else entirely. Two men stood outside, both dressed in delivery uniforms, but something about them didn't sit right. Their clothes looked worn, frayed at the edges, and too faded to belong to any delivery service I'd seen before. Neither of them smiled, and neither of them was holding any food. My stomach tightened as I took in the scene. It didn't add up. No food, no receipt, nothing that would indicate they were here to deliver our order. Just leave the food at the door, I said. It was a simple request, something every delivery driver hears. But instead of complying, one of the men took a small step closer. We need to come in, he said calmly. His voice was too measured, too controlled. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. That calmness only made the situation worse, like he expected me to just open the door and let them in without question. The second man stood behind him, silent, but his posture told me everything I needed to know. He was waiting for me to make the wrong move, to open the door just wide enough for them to slip inside. A cold, uneasy feeling washed over me. This wasn't right. Something was very wrong. I felt it in my gut, that instinctual pull screaming at me to act. Without hesitation, I slammed the door shut, the lock clicking into place just as fast as my hand could twist it. My heart was racing now, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the peephole, I watched the two men closely. They stood there, just outside the door, their frustration plain on their faces. One of them muttered something under his breath, while the other glanced around the hallway, checking to see if anyone had noticed. They didn't leave. Instead, they lingered, shifting their weight from foot to foot, as if waiting for something or someone. Then down the hallway, I saw another figure approaching. A man carrying a familiar brown paper bag with the logo of the restaurant we had ordered from. The real delivery driver. The realization hit me hard. These two men at my door weren't delivery workers. They were something else entirely. And they were here for reasons far worse than delivering food. The man carrying our food kept walking down the hall, oblivious to the two imposters standing just outside my door. From the peephole, I saw him glance at his phone, double-checking the address as he approached. I couldn't move. My mind raced with questions. What were these men planning? Why were they still standing there, waiting? And what would have happened if I had opened the door? The imposters exchanged quick glances, realizing their time was running out. I saw one of them clench his fists, frustration etched into his face. The real delivery driver came closer, finally noticing the two men loitering outside my apartment. He slowed down, his expression shifting from polite confusion to guarded suspicion. That was my chance. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the police. The sound of my heart pounding in my ears made it hard to concentrate, but I managed to explain the situation to the dispatcher, who promised that officers were on their way. I stayed by the peephole, watching as the delivery driver hesitated a few feet away from the imposters, sensing something was wrong. He hadn't reached the door yet, but thankfully, neither had they. Minutes felt like hours. The imposters kept glancing around, shifting nervously, realizing their plan was falling apart. They didn't have long to act before the real delivery driver figured out what was going on, or worse, before the police arrived. And then, through the narrow view of the peephole, I saw it, a patrol car pulling up in front of the building. Two officers stepped out, scanning the area as they approached the entrance. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with lingering fear. The two imposters saw the police at almost the same moment. They exchanged one last glance, resigned to the fact that they'd been caught. They didn't run, didn't even try to leave. It was as if they knew there was no point. The officers reached the front door and were on them within seconds. I watched as the men were cuffed and led outside, offering no resistance. Their calmness, even in defeat, was unsettling, like they were used to this, like it was just another failed attempt in a string of similar jobs. Elisa and I sat in the living room, the adrenaline still coursing through us, making it hard to sit still. Even with the police handling everything, the reality of what had almost happened kept hitting us in waves. Through the window, we watched the officers talk to the real delivery driver. One of them took his statement while the other kept a watchful eye on the two imposters, now sitting in the back of the police car. The officers knocked on our door a few minutes later, and I stepped outside to explain what had happened. I told them about the two men, the fake delivery uniforms, and how they insisted on coming inside. One of the officers nodded knowingly, as if this wasn't the first time he'd heard a story like ours. "You did the right thing," he told me. "If you'd opened that door—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need him to. I knew exactly what could have happened. A few days later, I received a follow-up call from the police. The officer on the other end had new information, details that made my stomach turn. The two men had hacked into the delivery app, intercepting orders from people living in specific neighborhoods. Their goal was simple but terrifying: gain access to homes by posing as delivery workers. They had already hit 2 apartments in the same way, stealing valuables and, in at least one case, assaulting the residents. Our address had been next. The officer assured me that they were doing everything they could to track down any other suspects involved. The night shift was always the same: pick up an order, drop it off, and move on. There was a certain rhythm to it, a routine that kept my mind occupied as the hours slipped by. I liked the quiet of the city at night. Fewer cars on the road, fewer distractions. Just me, the streets, and the steady hum of my car engine as I moved from one delivery to the next. Tonight started no different. I handled the usual orders, navigating the dimly lit streets with ease. Restaurants, apartments, suburban houses, they all blurred together in the dark. The deliveries were simple, mindless tasks that kept me busy, and I liked it that way. Around midnight, a new order came through. I glanced at the details and immediately noticed something strange about it. The instructions were unusually specific. Leave the food in the room to the right of the front door. Don't knock, don't call, just drop it off and leave. I reread the instructions, feeling a small knot of unease form in my gut. I had delivered to some odd places before, but something about this order felt different. Off, in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Still, I shrugged it off. Work was work, and orders like these weren't exactly uncommon. Some people just liked their privacy. The address led me to a part of the city I rarely visited. It was an older neighborhood where the houses were set far apart, with large, empty lots in between. The streets were narrow and poorly lit, making every turn feel like a descent into deeper isolation. As I drove, a creeping sense of discomfort began to settle over me. The roads were deserted, not a single car or pedestrian in sight. It was as if the entire area had fallen into a deep slumber, leaving only shadows behind. When I finally reached the address, I stopped the car and stared at the house for a moment. It sat back from the road, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and trees. The windows were dark, and the only light came from a porch light flickering above the front door. There was no movement inside, no sign of life. I checked the order again, confirming the address and instructions. Everything matched. I grabbed the food bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, the quiet pressing in around me. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way to the front door. The porch light buzzed and flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the worn floorboards. I reached the door and paused. Something about the stillness inside made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just an old house, but the silence felt heavy, as if it was holding its breath. I turned the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned smoothly in my hand. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing the dim interior beyond. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't supposed to go inside. That much was clear. Most deliveries ended at the doorstep, but the instructions had been specific, and curiosity got the better of me. Taking a breath, I stepped inside, the door clicking softly shut behind me. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. The house was silent, not a single creak or shuffle breaking the stillness. To my right, just as the instructions had said, was a closed door. I nudged it open with my elbow, balancing the food bag in my hands. The door swung inward, revealing a room that sent a chill down my spine. The room was small, with bare walls and no windows. It felt abandoned, like a space that had been forgotten over time. The only thing inside was a table placed precisely in the center of the room. On the table lay a strange collection of items: old, yellowed photographs scattered haphazardly, broken toys with missing limbs, and a few crumpled handwritten notes I couldn't decipher from where I stood. There were no chairs, no decorations, no other furniture. Just that table and the unsettling objects arranged on it. I set the food bag down on the edge of the table, careful not to touch anything else. The silence in the house pressed down on me, making my skin prickle. It was as if the room was waiting for something, or someone. I turned and made my way back to the front door, eager to leave. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard it. A voice, soft and calm, calling out from behind me. "Wait." I froze, hand hovering over the doorknob. The voice was soft, almost kind, but it sent a jolt of fear through my chest. It had come from the room behind me, the same room I had just left empty, or so I thought. For a moment, I stood perfectly still, every instinct screaming at me not to turn around. The door was right there, just a step away, but it felt miles out of reach. Footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, and unhurried. They tapped against the floor behind me. Whoever or whatever was back there wasn't in a rush. They were taking their time, closing the distance with each measured step. "Wait," the voice said again, just as calm as before. I knew then that I had made a mistake by entering this house. There was no reason to stay, no explanation I needed to hear. Whatever was behind me didn't want to explain. It wanted me to linger, to hesitate just a second too long. My hand shot to the doorknob, yanking it open with more force than necessary. The door swung wide, slamming against the wall as I bolted outside. I didn't care about noise. I didn't care about closing the door behind me. I only cared about getting out. The porch steps groaned under my weight as I flew down them, my breath coming in ragged bursts. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before finally getting the door unlocked. Slamming the door shut behind me, I started the engine with trembling hands and peeled out of the driveway without a second glance. I didn't know who or what had spoken to me, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. As I sped down the empty streets, the house disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness of the night. The knot in my stomach refused to loosen. Even though I was miles away now, the fear stayed with me, sharp and unyielding. Back at the restaurant, I sat in my car for a moment, catching my breath. My hands still trembled on the steering wheel, and my head swam with questions I couldn't answer. Finally, I made my way inside. The owner was wiping down the counter, glancing up as I walked in. He must have seen the look on my face because he put the cloth down and gave me his full attention. "You okay?" he asked, concern flickering in his eyes. I told him everything: the strange instructions, the unlocked door, the room with the bizarre objects, and the voice that called out just as I was leaving. I tried to explain the feeling of dread that had clung to me the entire time, but words didn't seem enough to capture it. The owner listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he gave a slow nod, then pulled out his phone. I watched as he opened the delivery app and searched for the address. Without hesitation, he blocked it. "That place isn't getting any more deliveries," he muttered. Blocking the address should have brought me some comfort, but it didn't. The unease I felt at that house stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next time I got an unusual delivery request, I hesitated before accepting it. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew the truth. Some things, some places, are better left alone. And next time I might not be lucky enough to escape.